my father has been diagnosed with dementia, and it explains a lot of the issues that we, his children, and other family members have had with him over the last 3 or 4 years. That being said, his memory is pretty good. It's the paranoia that's changed him. But in dealing with him, and I've been pretty close with my dad over the 40, it'll be 47 years on August 19th that I've been around. He's a pretty huge factor on who I am today. And to see, how can I explain this? It feels like I sometimes see the actual man and he doesn't know where he is sometimes. And it's almost like a fight. You can see the internal struggle. And it's hard to watch. It's hard for him to deal with. He actually knows, the doctor tells you. Like I said, his memory's not gone. It's just this, he has this kind of almost violent paranoia. And it's hard to deal with. And I find myself hearing this story among people my age more and more, that they've had to, leave work to take care of a parent, and with a similar situation, either dementia or Alzheimer's. I do find that frightening that you're saying, well, once these people get this one disease, it's because it's hard for everybody in the family, because whatever you think, and I don't know if you have a family member that has it or has ever had it, and I hope you never have to deal with that. But whoever you think you've known for the entirety of your life ceases to exist.
Yeah.
And there's moments where they realize, what the hell am I doing? What's going on? Because I've seen my dad do it, and it's kind of frightening on one hand. It's definitely extremely heartbreaking to see, like, the toughest, coolest person in the world struggle with this weird fear. There is one side of me, my brother and I have talked about this, that's like, if this ever happens to me, and I said this to my daughter, because she doesn't understand, even though she's in her 20s. Even it's hard for her to grasp that, she calls her grandfather Poppy, that Poppy is not there anymore. Like, whoever she knew, that ain't him. My brother and I, with gallows humor, we're like, put a bullet in our heads if we get to this point, because I don't want to, not just the burden aspect, but I don't want to destroy my family's memories of me, because for the last X amount of years, you have to deal with this version of me. Because also my father's in pretty decent health. And that was another thing my brother and I were talking about. Like, this guy could go for another 10 easy. He can clock in another 10 real easy. And that's 10 hard years where the deterioration is going to get worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
So on one hand, I'm like, I get it. But on the other hand, it is like, oof, you're going to have.
What you're saying is that people with this particular disease should be euthanized. And are we okay with saying that as a society?
I don't want to say that, because it's an ugly thought to have. And if we as his kids and him had that option, I don't even think we could present it to him, even though he's even vocalized to me he wishes he could, because it's frustrating. He's frustrated. But I don't know if I could go through it. In all honesty, I don't know if I could go through with that.
So this is a really common kind of thing that people will, this is why a lot of disability rights activists, not I don't even want to say a lot of, like the vast majority of disability rights groups are against assisted dying because they constantly have to deal with the fact that their lives are devalued by the remainder of the population. And like, just to, this is a really silly and extreme anecdote, but just to give you a sense of what it can feel like, I had a friend when I was in university who used a wheelchair, and he was a great looking guy, and he was really fun, and he was an Olympian. He was in both the summer and winter Paralympics, and traveled the world, all these sorts of things. And he said that it has happened a few times in his life where people have pointed at him just out of earshot and been like, man, I think that my life is bad. But then I look at a guy like that and I think,
Wow.
and people say this stuff because his life is for them their worst nightmare. But when you actually have a disability, you find it is not as bad as you think. Now, I will bracket dementia for a moment, but there are people who suffer from like very, very severe forms of disability. One of the people that I've been sort of working with has, is almost completely paralyzed and requires 24-hour support, but he is a very successful academic. And he's able to do that because he gets funding for care in the community. And otherwise, yeah, you would want your life to end. But if you have a situation, this is what disability rights activists have been fighting for decades, is saying, like, it's not necessarily my body that disables me, it's a society that disables me because it does not accommodate and make my life possible. So this is what the case that changed my mind was the case of Roger Frawley, where he continually asked for assisted living in the community, which is very costly, and instead he was offered assisted dying, and reminded of how costly his hospital care was, and that they couldn't discharge him into the community. And this happened to a friend of mine as well. Her brother, I can't remember what he had MS. And but his family did everything they could to accommodate him. He was still making music with very specialized tools and stuff like that. And his but when he was put into a specialized care facility, he noticed that the nurses, every time that he would get sick, they didn't really care. They were like, yeah, well, it's about time, isn't it? He's 38 or something like that. Yeah, and he was desperately texting his mother, please come help me, please come help me. They are just going to let me die. And in the end, he did die of like a lung infection or something like that, like a respiratory virus. So they expressly devalued his life. He wanted to live, but people had made judgments about the quality of his life because they were thinking, your life is my worst case scenario, right? Oh, I'd never want to live like that, right? Yeah, you might never want to live like that, but once you're actually in that situation, we can help people and accommodate people who do live like that, and they can live full lives. But this is the issue, that if you have a culture that really devalues and looks down on people with disabilities and thinks, oh, that's terrible, then yeah, you're going to vote. Sure, I wouldn't want to live like that, they would say. I think I've lost you again on the recording.
Nope, I'm here. I can hear you.
Oh, okay. So bringing back in dementia, it's completely understandable because this is probably one of the most challenging diseases. And it's challenging not just personally and emotionally, it's challenging in its unpredictability. It's challenging in the costs of the specialized care that are required. And it's challenging in terms of treatments not making very much headway. And so it's understandable that people will start to kind of say, well, look, in this kind of situation, perhaps it should be allowed. But that is like the most terrifying situation. And I will say that in most countries, it is not allowed for that particular reason.
It is so expensive. I think my dad was in a care facility before he took off. He did take off. He's fine though. It's not like he took off for the mountains and is living in a cabin. But he sold his home, and the care facility, I think, was in the range of like $7,000 or $8,000 a month. Now that's 3 times as much as he was paying for his living expenses when he owned a home. This becomes a disease for a certain class of people. Because if you're really poor, excuse me, and you don't have family that can take off work and take care of you, you don't own a home, um, you're probably going to get thrown out into the street at some point. And there's more and more. There was a report that came out recently in California in general. The growing population of the unhoused is elderly, is over 65. And I don't know how much of that population has dementia or Alzheimer's, but as someone that has worked with the unhoused, you're generally going to work with an older population. And sometimes you don't know if it's the living on the street that has destroyed someone's mind, or if it actually is dementia or Alzheimer's that's destroyed someone's mind. And when I think about even people trying to find any sort of cure or medication, there's medication my father takes. My aunt says it's helping. Like I said, my dad will call me every so often. Sadly, he doesn't talk as long as he used to. He's a very funny man. But does this stop a certain amount of research? Because we all know research into these drugs is extremely expensive. When you're dealing with a population that's kind of dying off anyway, the boomer population, who have tried like hell to hang on and prove to all other generations that you will not do us like we did our parents. Look at us, we're eating bran and we're climbing a mountain at 85. um, but there's this reality of dementia that I don't know how much research is going into drugs for it, but I feel like there is more research going into the quote unquote humane dying of people with this one disease. Um, that scares me. Even though this is something that is difficult to deal with, it does scare me that we can look at people with this, especially again, older people that aren't going to contribute to the workforce. They're only going to be, I don't want to say a leech on society, but they're only going to cost money. And that was one of the first things Canada posted when I looked up MAID numbers. I just wanted to see, after I read your article, I was like, how many of these have happened? And I was expecting to see numbers in, maybe a few hundred. 4% of the deaths in the country come
Yeah.
from assisted suicide.
Oh, and it's growing. It's growing exponentially, and in the Netherlands, it's 5%. So will it stop research into like dementia treatments and that sort of thing? No, I don't think so. I hope not. Anyway, there are other things that are stopping research into that. That's a whole other can of worms. But I don't think MAID on its own will stop research into life prolonging treatments. The trouble is that there is a sense of exhaustion within healthcare systems
Mm,
about even this desire and drive, that the research is costly, the treatments are costly, and they make very little headway against the disease. And there's a sense, well, you're fighting against the inevitable, and you need to stop. So an example of this is, unfortunately, my dad was recently diagnosed with cancer, and
mm. Sorry to hear about that.
uh, yeah, he's not. He was 65 when he was diagnosed, and it was really, really, really difficult to get him any treatment. Like, there was absolutely no sense of urgency. They didn't even tell him that he had cancer for like 3 months.
Dang.
Yeah. So it was just a horrible, horrible situation. So it was not only that he was diagnosed with cancer, it was that there was no sense of urgency whatsoever. And that they were very content to just let him die, and that they had counseled him to die, basically. And I was at a conference, and we were at dinner afterward, and I was talking to my friend about this, my friend and colleague about it. And I was really distraught. This was really fresh for me. And someone at the next table had been listening to our conversations. This is someone at the conference. And he says, and I said to my friend, they were just saying, sorry, you have to accept it. Even though I knew there was a treatment. And by the way, my father has since had this treatment and is cancer free.
Oh, congratulations. Hey.
Touch wood. Oh, touch wood, touch wood. Uh, because I and my sister, like, I did a full-on literature review, like a full-on literature review, and like did all the they didn't even tell my dad about this treatment at all. Didn't tell, nothing. We had to push and beg and plead for this treatment, and finally we managed to get it. But anyways, they didn't even tell him about this. Anyway, so I said they'd canceled him to just accept it, and the man at the table says to me, "You have to accept it. You have to accept it. We can't afford all of this. We can't afford all of this." Yeah, like, how dare you cling on to life? I'm sorry, but like the defining feature of the Progressive Project since the French Revolution was the desire to prolong life and to make it better, to make human life something that you want to live for as long as possible. What I have in mind here is my favorite sort of piece of work that I love to quote endlessly is from the Marquis de Condorcet, where he writes he's literally being hunted down during the Terror. And he writes the most optimistic tract anyone has ever written, where it's 9 chapters of the progressive, of the progress of humanity. And in the 10th chapter, he says, he's looking into the future. So everything's what's come before us, and the 10th chapter is what's coming for us in the future. He says we won't even die anymore. He says the human lifespan will know of no upper limit. And he was even more progressive than most Enlightenment philosophers in that he recognized that most of the impediments that were appearing natural in the world, like women's inferiority, or the inferiority of other races, supposed inferiority of other races, were simply social impediments. He says, once we remove these social impediments, we will find that women are geniuses, like again, rational, can be geniuses, can be rational, just like everybody else, right? That there is a fundamental equality to humanity, that you just have to remove these things that are in the way. And we're going to do that. We're going to do that. And the idea that like we are living older and older and older, this should be fantastic. This should be a great thing. We should be celebrating this. Instead, it becomes a problem. I was asked to write for Unheard, like a quick kind of response article. It was like the weekend, about a couple months back, of this article that was written in the Times that was basically saying, yeah, I'm sorry to say it, but somebody has to. Old people, you need to, see yourselves out. You're just too costly.
Jesus.
And I couldn't, but I'm just like on my weekend or whatever, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. I had to write this article in like a couple of hours, but it was just utterly shocking. But you see that advocates slip up like this all the time. And in that Compact article, I put a few examples of where they slip up, where they say they say things like, I can't believe in a country with such an expensive aging population, we haven't thought of euthanasia sooner.
Whoa.